Marcus Bennett had eaten alone at Delacroix every Thursday for 3 months, and he'd made his peace with it. The restaurant sat on the corner of 5th and Larkin in downtown Denver, all warm brick and low candlelight. The kind of place that felt like it was made for couples and business dinners, not a 34-year-old architect quietly working through a plate of seared salmon while pretending not to notice the waitstaff's pitying glances. He came because the food was good and because his apartment had started to feel too quiet. Since the divorce, and a crowded restaurant, even eaten alone, was better than an empty kitchen table. He was halfway through his glass of Cabernet when a woman he had never seen before in his life sat down across from him, uninvited, and reached across the white tablecloth to take his hand. "Please pretend you love me for the next 10 minutes, she said, low and fast, her eyes darting somewhere over his shoulder. "I will explain everything, I promise. Just, please." Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. She was strikingly pretty in a way that made the request feel even more absurd. Dark waves of hair falling over one shoulder, wearing a deep green dress that looked like she'd dressed for someone else's night, not this improvised performance. Her hand was warm and trembling slightly around his. "I'm sorry, what? 10 minutes, she repeated, squeezing his fingers. "I'll pay for your whole dinner. I'll pay for next month's dinner. Just look at me like you're happy I'm here." Something about the desperation in her voice, more than the strangeness of the request, made Marcus decide in that instant to go along with it. He turned his hand over so their palms met properly and smiled, the kind of smile he hadn't used in over a year. "Okay," he said quietly. "What's your name, in case anyone asks?" "Sophie," she breathed, visibly relieved. "Sophie Callahan. And you're a very convincing boyfriend, for someone I just terrified." "Marcus, and for the record, you didn't terrify me." Intrigued, maybe. Her eyes flicked past him again, toward the entrance, and Marcus resisted the urge to turn and look. He could piece together enough. A man had just walked in. Someone Sophie clearly didn't want walking over and finding her alone. He leaned in, slightly playing the part, brushing a strand of hair back from her face with the gentlest touch he could manage. "He's not looking anymore," Sophie whispered after a moment, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I think the hostess sat him on the other side." "Ex-boyfriend?" "Ex-fiancé," she corrected, wincing. "Grant. We were supposed to get married in September. I called it off 2 months ago and he still hasn't accepted it. He shows up wherever I go, grocery store, gym, my sister's birthday party. I don't think he's dangerous exactly, just unable to let go in a way that started to feel suffocating. And tonight he showed up here." "Tonight he showed up here," she echoed, and I panicked. "And you were the only person sitting alone who looked like you might not have." Somebody waiting for a real explanation. Marcus laughed despite himself, and the sound seemed to surprise them both. "Well, I did have a whole exciting evening planned. Salmon, a glass of wine, possibly dessert if I was feeling wild. I'm sorry I ruined it." "You didn't ruin it," he said, and meant it more than he expected to. "You made it interesting." They kept up the performance a while longer, though it stopped feeling entirely like performance somewhere around the time the waiter came back and Sophie ordered a second glass of wine without missing a beat, settling into the seat like she intended to stay. Marcus found himself asking real questions instead of scripted ones. What she did for work, how long she'd lived in Denver, whether she actually liked the seared salmon or had ordered it purely as cover. She was a set designer for a local theater company, she told him, currently deep in production, for a period drama that had her spending entire days debating the historical accuracy of drapery. She'd grown up in a small town outside Boulder and moved to the city for exactly this kind of work, the kind that let her build entire worlds out of wood and fabric and imagination. 20 minutes passed, then 40, and neither of them mentioned Grant again except once. When Sophie glanced discreetly across the restaurant and reported, with visible relief, that he'd left without ever spotting her. "You could go now," Marcus said. "The mission's over. You don't owe me anything else." Sophie studied him for a moment, and something shifted in her expression, softer than the panic that had brought her to his table. "I know," she said. "I don't really want to, though. Is that strange? Given how the evening started, I don't think either of us gets to use the word strange anymore." She laughed, a real laugh this time, unguarded, and Marcus felt something in his chest, loosen that had been tight for longer than he wanted to admit. They stayed another hour, ordering dessert to split, a bourbon-soaked bread pudding neither of them finished because they were too busy talking to eat. He learned she'd almost married a man who wanted her to stop designing sets and take a stable office job that Grant had never once come to, see one of her shows in the 3 years they'd dated, that she'd called off the wedding not out of a single dramatic moment, but out of a slow accumulation of feeling. Smaller every year she stayed. Marcus told her about his divorce, about a marriage that had ended not in betrayal but in two people slowly becoming strangers who happened to share a mortgage. about how he'd started eating at Delacroix because the silence of his apartment had become its own kind of loud. "So we're both running from quiet houses," Sophie said. "Looks that way." When the check came, she reached for it before he could, waving off his protest. "I promised you dinner." A promise is a promise, even one made in a moment of blind panic. Outside, the Denver night had turned cool. String lights strung along the restaurant's awning throwing soft gold light onto the sidewalk. Sophie hugged her jacket tighter around herself, and Marcus found he wasn't ready for the night to end, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it. "For what it's worth," he said, "that might be the best fake relationship I've ever been in. High bar, considering it's your only one. Exactly why it counts." She smiled, looking at him a moment longer than the joke required. "Can I ask you something? And you can say no." "Go ahead. Would you want to do this again, minus the fake part? Just dinner? An actual date, where nobody's ex walks through the door, and nobody has to pretend anything." Marcus felt something in his chest lift, lighter than it had in over a year. "I'd like that, on one condition." "What's that?" "Next time you ask before you sit down." Sophie laughed, extending her hand for him to shake, an absurd formality given everything that had already passed between them that night. "Sophie Callahan," she said. "Nice to properly meet you." "Marcus Bennett," he replied, shaking her hand, holding it a beat longer than necessary. "Likewise." They exchanged numbers on the sidewalk outside Delacroix, and Sophie left first, glancing back once before she turned the corner. Like she wanted to make sure the evening had actually happened and wasn't something she'd imagined out of desperation and wine. 3 days later, Marcus took her to a small Italian place 2 blocks from the theater where she worked, and this time there was no whispered plea, no borrowed intimacy. Just 2 people who'd already skipped past the awkward small talk because they'd been forced into honesty from the very first minute. Grant never surfaced again. Not at dinner, not at the theater, not anywhere in the months that followed. As if the universe had decided he'd served his single, necessary purpose, and could exit the story for good. By the following spring, Sophie had a permanent seat at Marcus's table at Delacroix, no longer someone who needed an excuse to sit down. He asked her once, nearly a year later, over the same bourbon bread pudding they'd shared that first strange night, whether she regretted the way it had all started. The panic, the invented affection, the whole absurd premise of a stranger begging another stranger to pretend. Sophie thought about it, swirling the last of her wine. "No," she said finally. "I think some people spend years working up the courage to be honest with someone. We just got there backwards. Panic first, honesty second, love somewhere in between." She reached across the table, the same gesture that had started everything, and took his hand. This time with no urgency in it at all, only certainty. Turns out pretending to love you for 10 minutes was the easiest thing I ever did, meaning it took considerably less convincing. Marcus squeezed her hand back, thinking that of all the empty Thursday nights he'd sat at that table waiting for something to change, he'd never once imagined it would walk in wearing a green dress and ask him to lie, only to end up being the truest thing that had happened to him in years.